All right. Clock says 2:15. Hi, everyone. Hi. Hi. 2:15, so we're going to start rolling. I'm Jason. All the testing notes, the code is up at that GitHub. You can pull it down. Follow along if you want. It's all in steps for in branches. My testing notes are right there, so if you want to take a skim through that real quick and decide this talk sucks, you want to go see something else, go for it. It does not hurt my feelings. Follow me at Twitter. It's probably the easiest way to say something and ask questions after. Or you can see my blog that has 5 posts right now on some Angular things, but more to come. So every Angular presentation is required to have this slide now by law. So I totally agree with it. It's 100% accurate. And it's just, it's not really anything to do with Angular specifically. It's just anytime you're learning anything new, you kind of feel that way. For me, the very cool part at the very center was when I first figured out how integrated testing was inside of Angular. The Angular team has built testability as part of the framework from the very beginning. That was one of the core competencies of the framework. Something people ask me a lot why I like Angular over Knockout, which I used to write, or other JavaScript frameworks, is because testability is one of those things that makes my life easier, just the way my brain works. Hitting F5 a lot and debugging through things all day just drives me insane. I like it when I can just run things. So having a framework that has that same thought built in makes my life a lot better. Compared to other things like Backbone or Knockout, they're a lot harder to test, and they wouldn't intuitively think that because it's JavaScript and you can kind of overwrite whatever you want to make things testable. But you end up having to overwrite so much, you have to overwrite low-level APIs in the browser. It just becomes a pain in the butt, and Angular helps fix a lot of that for you. This is the stuff we're going to go over today. First, I'm going to set up Karma. I'm going to test a controller, which is what most people end up starting their Angular apps around, or controllers. HTTP, which is probably the harder thing to test in most JavaScript testing frameworks, because you have to use something else to mock that up for you. Directives, which I like a lot. This is the second favorite thing I like about Angular, directives. And testing them can be kind of strange. It looks strange at first, but then once you understand what it's doing, it's really easy. And then I'm going to make sure we get at least one protractor end-to-end point test. And what that means is that I'm going to write a test that actually opens up the page, and it clicks on things as a normal person would, and then gets values off of it, where unit tests are just running code. And then depending on how much time we have, I'll probably ask for either someone to say, factory filter or timeout, something that maybe you've worked on in one of your projects that you want help testing, because there's not enough time to cover all of them. That's it. That's the slides. So right now all I have is just a very basic Node application. I'm not going to be using Node very much, although Node is pretty awesome. This is my whole web server in 4 lines of code. Basically, I'm just using Express to host the app for me and host some static content and put it on port 3333. Later on, I'm going to add Ajax in here. And then on the index page, I'm just using some Bootstrap. And then I just loaded the Angular library itself, and then I have my Angular testing.js, which is hooked into an ng app that I already pre-set up. But it's just setting up the module. So there's nothing here, literally. So inside of my package JSON, I just have, I'm going to run supervisor, so that way when I run and update my code in Node, it'll just restart automatically, won't have to deal with that. So I'm not going to talk about Node anymore. I'm just going to start it up. Whoop. Get out of here. Turn off the slides. And we're rolling. The button doesn't do anything, it's just blue. I liked it. All right, so first thing we want to do, and this is something that you can do in any of your projects right now to get started with testing, is once you have Karma installed on your computer, you just do karma init on the root of your directory, and it's going to ask you a bunch of questions about how you want to set up testing in your project. Most of the defaults are just fine. For example, the first one, which testing framework do you want to use? Jasmine. I like Jasmine a lot for Angular apps. The Angular team uses Jasmine. Most Angular libraries use Jasmine for their testing stuff. So there's a lot of support in the Angular community around Jasmine. You can also use Mocha. Unfortunately, Mocha doesn't have all this built-in stuff that Jasmine does, because they're trying to abstract the testing stuff in a different way. So if you're new to this and you're not sure what you want to use, I would say use Jasmine, and I've used it for a long time. I think it's great. Require.js, so the Karma folks are trying to be agnostic. They're like, this isn't an Angular tool, when really it is, but they wanted to have support for other JavaScript testing things they want to do, so I never used require, because Angular already has dependency injection built in. The other thing that's really nice about Karma that you can do is you can run your unit tests against multiple browsers at the same time. You can run like Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, and Phantom, depending on what environment you're working in. For now, we're just going to use Chrome. So this is where you have to tell Karma which libraries that you want to use and which code you're testing. So right now I just have a lib folder with Angular. So I'm going to do lib Angular.js. We need to put in anything that we need to help Angular with its mocking stuff. So Angular comes with pre-built-in mocking. Basically, they add support into the Angular framework to make it more testable, so that way you're not shipping all this testable code to your publicly served websites. So it's Angular mocks. And then now we're going to add in all the code that we want to have run that's being tested while we're running the application. So I put all of my stuff inside the app. And then we tell Karma to look under all the folders, under app, and then look for any JS files for the application. So all the JS files will always be reloaded into Karma every time they change or anytime we add a new file or delete them. We're not excluding any files. And we always want Karma to rerun all the tests every time a file changes. This lets you get continuous feedback while you're writing your application about when your tests run and when they break. You don't have to push like Control-T or whatever to run your tests. They just are always running. There's no point in ever putting no here, because the only time you don't want to run Karma not always changing things is when like you're doing continuous integration. And for that stuff, you want to do a command line flag. And we're done. So we come over here, it made Karma. All these questions that we just went through are in here, so when we need to edit them later, we can come find them. And so now we got to start Karma. It launches an instance of Chrome that it manages using a WebDriver. So then whenever any files change, it communicates with Chrome and says, hey, here's some new tests to run, and it runs it. And you'll see right now we don't have any tests running. We have 0, 0, but we're going to fix that right now. So the first thing we do, just to sort of see what's going on, is to write just our first test. I started following this convention where anything I'm testing, I put a spec file next to it. Basically, that helps give you like a high-level overview of which files actually have tests running around them without having to run code coverage analysis tools. But it also helps it so that way you can find the test faster. So in Jasmine, which is what we're going to be using, in order to set up a test, an instance for things to test, we use something called describe. If you've used BDD testing before, this follows the same pattern as that. Basically, you want to start talking about things that you want to start testing. So we're just testing Jasmine just to make sure everything works. I added this convention where I put this little arrow guy in, so that way when the test's running and things break, it's easy to figure out where things are broken. You'll see that pop up. It doesn't mean anything. We pass in a function that we want to call, and then in order to run an assertion inside of Jasmine, we use what's called if. It just says that here's the thing that we're testing, and we give it we're just going to say 1 plus 1 equals 2. We pass another function, and we say expect. Expect is how you tell Jasmine, here's what you expect the value to be. So we expect, I'm sorry, not what the value be, but what you want to test. You put the thing that you're testing first, so we're going to say 1 plus 1, and we expect this to equal 2. So what's going to happen is I'm going to, WebStorm will save is when you switch, between you change files. I'm going to press Command S, which is going to save the file, and if you watch down here, you're going to see Karma, oh, it did it because I clicked on it. It executed that test right away. Say we were to write a bad test and save it, we would see, it expected 2 to equal 3, and you'll see this little hat, or the little arrow that I put in, shows where the test was failing. So we'll switch this back so we have a nice fun test working. And now we're off to our start. We sort of have validated that our testing framework is set up, and now we can start writing tests and features for our application. So for my app, in order just to make things easy, I'm just going to create a list of contacts, which is just going to be a list of my family with their pictures and names. So what I like to do, similar to John, is I like to make a folder per feature. I think that helps separate your code really nice. The Angular, like, here's how to make an Angular app, says controllers and views and services, and honestly, I just find it to be a big mess. I don't like it. So let's make a new view. In this view, we're just going to make a div. We're going to set our controller.
You set that up with a JavaScript file.
Oh, thank you, sir. Much better, thanks. And then we're just going to have a message to make sure our app is wired up right. Then, whoop, still messed up. All right, that's better. We're going to have a contacts controller. One thing that, since I set up, just put app on the global namespace, I'm just going to cheat a little bit and just start using that for everything. There's better ways of doing that, but we don't care since it's just a testing talk. Oop. All right, and on this scope, we're just going to put a message. We are going to go down to our index. We're going to add this app contacts control. And then, since we don't have any kind of routing built in, but I still want to have the idea of routing where I'm putting a feature over somewhere else, I'm going to use something called ng-include. This is just going to load a template from somewhere else on the web server. So what I'm doing is I'm just saying, hey, load this contacts template. Contacts template. Oh, I am. Thanks. That will make it not work. So I'm just loading the contacts template from here, and this just says load ng controller. So it's sort of like a fake route. And let's make sure everything works. Load it up. Hello world. So this means that and the fonts aren't going to work because of no internet. That's great. So hello world works. That means our application is wired up. Now we can start writing some tests for this feature.
Do you have an Ethernet cable on it?
You know, it doesn't work. I plugged it in earlier. Yeah, pretty lame. So let's write a test. Whoop. Right again. Contacts control.spec. We're going to describe our contacts control. And when you're testing Angular applications, inside of every describe, you have to tell it which module you're loading, or which module you're testing against. So there's this, we say before each module, Angular testing. What does this mean? This Angular testing module I defined as sort of the root module of my application, right here. So what this says is that every time this set of tests runs, load up everything inside this module first in the dependency injection swimming pool, so that way when we go ask for things, we can pluck kids out of the swimming pool and test them. The next thing we need to do is we need to set up our controller itself that we want to test against. So we're going to say before each, we're going to inject. What inject does is that's the way that we pull the controller and anything that we need out of Angular out, so that way we can write tests against it. We want the root scope, and we want the controller factory. If you came to John's talk, you'll remember the root scope is just the very top level scope. I'm only using it to new up new scopes, so that way I'm not polluting scopes later on, so we don't create any kind of strange issues. You don't really need to create new ones all the time. You can just attach the root scope, but it's just a convention I started following, and it makes sense to me. So we have var scope equals root scope.new, and we want to create a context controller. Equals controller. And then, if you remember controllers, you can inject dependencies into them, and the way that we tell this controller, when we're building it, which dependencies we want to inject. We say scope is scope. Now what this says is that this is a new anonymous type that has a property of scope, and I'm setting this value, this scope there, and smashing them together. Oh, I'm missing something. There we go. That's better. All right. So what we want to do is we just want to make sure it exists. Contacts, control, find. So why is this not going to work? Well, I have var set here. So what you want to do, and then you'll start following this pattern everywhere, is you're going to put all of your testing bits inside of the closure one above the thing that you're testing. It won't make any sense now, but it'll make sense when we get going. Oop. Get rid of these. Switch back to here, and we ran 2 tests. Now that means this contract controller, I'm successfully loading it out of the dependency injection swimming pool, smashing some scopes together, and now we have something we can test. So if we remember, if we go back to our contacts controller, you remember that we're setting a message on here just as the controller gets set up. So let's make sure that that's working. And it's all lowercase, of course. So now we are successfully seeing that we set something on scope. All right, so we have a contacts controller. So if you just think about Angular apps that you've probably written, you're like, okay, well now I have things on my scope that I want to test, functions, values, whatever. This is how you set that up. Now, say the next most common use case of things that you're trying to test are you have a server that has some endpoints of some data that you want to load, you want to pull that stuff down, and you want to write some tests for it. Well, typically, if you've ever tried to test against Ajax things before, you usually need something like sign-on or something else to mock out the Ajax calls for you to make sure that those actual Ajax calls aren't made to the server, it's all happening locally. Luckily, with Angular, they have a nice abstraction over that. So what happens with their abstraction is it just gives you a nice API to intercept that automatically without having to download some other library that will intercept that Ajax call for you. So if we go back to our contacts controller, we're going to add HTTP. Typically, I would suggest using resource, but resource is kind of confusing. The nice thing is HTTP and resource, the way that you write tests for them are exactly the same. So I'm just going to use HTTP for anybody who hasn't really spent a long time in Angular land, so it makes more sense. So we're going to pretend that we're going to call an API. We're going to get all the contacts. If you're not familiar, the promise out of here is usually then, but there's a nice one that's just success that wires all of our data together in one happy little parameter. So we're going to say scope.contacts equals data. So now what we need to do is we need to go back into our test. Actually, you know what? Let's wire up the server first. So let's say app.get API contacts response. And we're just going to return some JSON data. And to make things kind of easy for you guys to understand, I'm just going to put my family in here. So I have my wife, 28. I have a little baby that's 9 months, but we'll say he's 1 right now. I have a dog named Bo. He's 6 years old, and we have Grandma, who just turned 80. If we were to look, our node server restarted. We can go look in Postman, make sure our API endpoint's working. So there's my API. It's returning some data, so we know it's going to work on our app. We'll go back to the controller. We'll say, oh, that's wired up. So now if we go to our application itself, oh, we're missing the view. Let's go back into contacts, and we'll say, let's make some pretty HTML to make this look nice. So we'll go div, media, ng, repeat, contact in contacts, image, media, object, pull left, image. We have some images here that I have tied to the contact name. .jpg. We have another div because Bootstrap loves divs, as we all know. And we have the age. Hopefully this makes sense to you guys. We'll see in a sec. So here we are. We're loading up some Ajax data, and it has a picture and the age of the endpoints I just sent out. And make this a little bigger. So you can see grandma, dog, all that stuff. Okay, so how do we test this? Well, we ask the swimming pool for something called HT backend. That's just sort of the abstraction that it gives us to say, hey, when something's called, return something else. So we'll say HTTP, let's put it up here, backend. Now, normally you would need to call this something else in order to make everything resolve right. Because if you were to do this, JavaScript is very confused. It doesn't, if it's gray, nothing, it isn't being touched yet. So what the Angular team is something really clever. They made this convention where if you put some underscores on either side of something, and then you ask for it from the dependency injection, it'll give you the version, whatever you're asking for, without that chopped off. So now we have better looking code. So we'll say HT backend, expect get API contacts dot respond, and we'll just pass in some dummy data. Leave it like that. So it's saying when we get the contacts, give me just one person back in here, and then we will say. If we go back to here, we can look and see that there's no, this is inside of something else. It's not being called yet. And the test, you can write a test for that that basically just says, you know, no contacts yet. Scope.contacts to be undefined. And we haven't returned any data yet, so I'll just turn this off real quick. In Jasmine, if you want to comment on a test, you put an X in front of it, comment to that one. So you don't have to like do a bunch of slashes everywhere. So context isn't defined because we haven't called the HTTP backend. So what's really nice about Jasmine is you can do this thing called like scope test nesting. You can essentially like set up a whole bunch of tests, and you're like, well, I need all this test set up. Now I need to write some other tests that rely on something else to happen. Typically, in like if you use something like an N unit style or Q unit style setup, you have to have a whole bunch of setup fixtures. What's nice about Jasmine is you can just nest them. So we just nest and say, you know, hey, the server responded. All of our controller stuff is still set up. We can just start adding more tests to it. And we can say, hey, server respond. And by the way you make it respond is you just call it flesh. All the HTTP, anything that's like asynchronous, like timeout, HTTP, anything that Angular has a nice abstraction around so that we can write synchronous tests, it's all with the .flesh. So if you're trying to think like, how do I test timeout? It's a flesh. So now we expect scope.contacts to equal this. Now we have 5 working tests. Now, if this looks funny to you, how come this object right here can be equal to some other object that we define somewhere else? Jasmine has this, the to equal basically says, look at both of these things, and if they're structurally the same, they are equal. They're not like object pointers. If you want to do an object pointer, it's to be. So this is going to fail, and it's going to say, hey, I expected this object to be this object. Well, they're both the same. Is you just want to check and make sure they're equal. This lets you get around like setting up like higher level things that you want to have to keep track of that you pass around. If you're in .NET land, you have to deal with this quite a bit, where making sure all of your object pointers are all correct or you just go insane. So to equal just makes that really nice, because in JavaScript we don't care about types. Okay. So all this is fun and good, but I realize part of my requirements is that this context thing that I made, I'm going to end up reusing in different parts of my application. So anybody who's worked in Angular long enough immediately would probably think of making a directive for it. And testing directives kind of looks very goofy at first until you understand what Angular is doing behind the scenes, and then it becomes more intuitive. So we're going to work on that. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a directive. I'm going to call it contact. And app directive contact. It's going to only be a element directive. And it's going to have a template because I think inline templates are gross. And every time I see them, I cringe just a little bit and die inside. It's going to replace the element directive that we're making, and then I'm going to add some scope. So what I need to do is now I need to do some refactoring. Let's make a new HTML file, contact. Let's take this guy out. Post it in there. Now, since we're not going to do the ng repeat inside the individual directive anymore because that's going to happen higher up. So let's take that out. This is just an individual contact now. Go back to our contacts page, and we're going to say contact, do the for each in there, and then we need a way to pass in the current contact that's in our list, and we need to pass it down to our directive. And using isolate scopes inside of Angular, we're going to pass that object in. So I started doing this convention when I have things that are all kind of named the same. I just call it data. And what happens when you do something like this is that then if you have, I still want it to be called contact inside of here, and I want it to be called contact out here without having to type this, because I think typing contact 3 times looks really strange and it's confusing. So do data. So there's a little bit of Angular glue where I'm going to say contact, create a 2-way binding to data. And that's going to glue the controller contact data to the directive contact template. I could make a regular one like this and then switch everything back to contact. I think that looks weird, so I'd rather do it here and make this part ugly. So let's go to our app. Oh, I'm forgetting one more thing. We have to add this directive to our scripts. Great. So it should look exactly the same when it's unloading. Yep, sweet. So everything's working. Now let's write a test. Okay. As the contact module. Whoops. Inject. So we need a root scope again. And we'll come back to that later. So here we go. Parent scope is going to be basically the equivalent of what our controller scope is. Directives can have any kind of parent scope that you want, but for now, we'll just pretend that parent scope is the same as this contact controller scope. So this guy and this guy, actually I said this guy, are equivalents. And then we're going to add a test contact. I'm intentionally creating different contacts with different names and ages so that way you guys can see that there aren't tests polluting across different things. That these are all very isolated tests, so that way a good unit test knows that it's tests the smallest chunk of code possible without leaky abstractions. So in Angular, when it's working on directives, the way that it knows about them is through something called compile. Angular does this internally when it parses your page, but since we're not running on a page itself, we have to basically set up Angular and say, hey, I'm going to give you some directives that you're going to want to load up. So the way that we do that is we create an element, and we say Angular.element. This is the same thing as doing like stuff, like making a div. So we're going to say contact. Data equals test contact. Test contact is the same as this guy. And then just close it up. So now we have our element. It's created. And now we have to let Angular know about that. And the way that we do that is we inject something called compile. Compile is something that's used internally by Angular to figure out all the stuff that you're doing on your page. And we're going to call it directly. So we have to say, hey, compile this element. And now it returns a function. So compile takes some text, or it takes an element, and then it learns about it. And then it says, hey, now what do you want me to do with this? Here's a linking function that you use with this element. You need to attach it to a scope. So we're going to attach it to the parent scope. So this is the same. This step right here is literally doing the same thing as what I did right here, just in code. And then if we were to inspect it right now, even though we've compiled it, this actually nothing's happened to this yet. We have to tell Angular to digest what's changed. If you're not familiar with the basics of Angular, how it watches things, basically it just creates a bunch of expressions that it runs through and checks, it evaluates each one of them and sees if anything changes. And it kind of moves along, and it has events set up on the DOM that trigger those. But since we're not really on a real DOM, we're just in JavaScript code, we have to tell Angular to do this manually. And the way that we do that is parent scope.digest. Some of you may have called this from your own code. Basically, we're just saying, you have some changes, go find them. So what's going to happen after this step is that this element is going to get compiled, and all of the stuff is going to be set up for the directive. This will get run against the HTML that I created, and it's going to go load the template. So what we would expect to happen is we would expect that it creates an element with Johnny. Right? So contain the element HTML, turn all the element stuff into strings so we can go look for something, and it's going to have Johnny. And then we expect it to have age 45. Right? So we run this, we bring up our console, we say, hey, 2 tests failed, everything's set up right, and we go up and we look and see what it's mad about, and it says, there's an unexpected GET request for contact HTML. It tried to load the template from a server, and there's no server for it to respond to, so it's a failed request. Or it doesn't even try to, actually, it just kills it right away. Because the problem is that if you write clean directives, you can't have templates markup in here. So how do you get around this, right? You can do something like what we did earlier with the contact controller, and we can say like, hey, give me like HTTP backend, and when you get this backend and return this stuff, and your tests are going to be kind of kludgy at that point, and it gets annoying. So what we have is we have something called the Karma to ng HTML preprocessor, which is something that the testing guys wrote because they're probably finding it to be a pain in the ass too. So I have it in my dev dependencies. It's all ready to go because I would not try to do npm install the U because that would just be terrible. And so this is ready to go. So how do we set this up? Well, we go into Karma, and Karma has something called preprocessors that matches files before serving them to the browser. Hey, this sounds close to what we want, right? So we're going to say for every folder with every file that ends in HTML to run it through the ng HTML2.js preprocessor. What does this say? This means load all the HTML that we got on the application and then put it into the HTTP backend cache so that way when you try to get it, it's already loaded up and saved for Angular to do things with. And we have to set up the ng HTML2.js preprocessor. All right, hopefully I typed that right, because if I didn't, it won't work. Strip prefix, and I'll see what this is in a sec. So if you look at the application, you'll see we have Angular testing, and then we have public, and we have app. Well, Karma is living on this level. So when it finds all the HTML files, it's like, oh, hey, you got public app context. But when we look at our real application, we don't have a public anything. It's served right under app. So we have to tell the preprocessor, hey, these files, Angular doesn't know about this public folder, so get rid of it. And we have to give it a module name. I call it preload all HTML templates. We put all of the HTML into a module that we want to include on our test. So when we go back to our test, nope, not that one. We say load a module, and we call it preload all HTML templates, like that. So if we go back to here, we should be working. No, still failing. Well, I obviously fat-fingered something, and I don't know what, so through the magic of television, step 6. We'll fix it. So now, oh, I know what I did wrong. So I didn't close Karma. So whenever you mess with the Karma config, that's the one file that it doesn't watch as itself, so you have to restart it. I even have that in here too to close Karma, but I don't pay attention. So now all of our stuff is working. It's great. Now we can successfully load all the HTML templates in the app, just using this. Now we don't have to have ugly string concatenated templates that the poor sods from Visual Studio can't look at, because it all just looks like strings because they're using Visual Studio. It's bad for them.
It's not that bad.
All right, one more thing. Oh yeah, so what I want to do on the app is I want to say like, hey, when I click on the picture, I want to increase the age of the contact I'm looking. And since we're using two-way model binding with our context, that will update the controller copy as well. So let's go into contact, and we'll say, make a new one. We'll ng click, and we're going to, whoops, not there, here. Class, it's going to be a button default, and we want it to be this image, so I'll take this guy up there. And then we really don't even need all this stuff on here anymore, so we'll take that off and put it here. So what did this do? This turned the picture into a button. And see, now they're buttons. They don't do anything yet. Let's add a link function. This is also the other thing that people typically have a lot of trouble testing are link things, because they don't know how to get to it, which I'll show you how to do in a sec. So what are we going to have? We're going to have scope.addYear equals function and we're going to say scope.contact.age plus 1. So now we click on it and we can add ages. Make me really old. This talk is aging me. So how do we test this, right? So we go back into our contact spec. We create a new thing that we want to test. So we're going to describe adding age, right? We're going to say before every test we want to run, we want to do something dot add year, right? So, because all I really want to do, I don't care about all the parent scope, I don't care about anything. All I want is some way to get to this function right here so I can add it and have stuff happen. So how do we get to that using the directive scope? This is something, if you've ever written tests before, something that's new is this isolate scope. I didn't show this earlier because I used Git to fast forward. But isolate scope means, so if we were to come here and look using the inspector, right? We have a scope, which is has our add year on it, like we'd expect. But the problem is if we have the element, or X, sorry. Whoop. That is X. I'm confused. Anyways. If you wanted to get the actual scope from the directive itself, it used to be just dot scope, but they took that out because, I don't know, they're the Angular guys and they change things sometimes. I'm not sure what their reasoning was, but they added this new way to get the isolate scope that you created using this function. So now we have the directive scope from the isolate scope, and we click add year, and then we say, hey, the age goes from 45 to 46 because Mr. Johnny was 45 before, but now I want to increase his age to 46. And so I expect the directive scope dot contact dot age to equal 46. And we'll put this up. It reruns, and now we have 46. It's not, 49, it's 46. Now, the other thing that you'll notice too is that we have this parent scope up here, and we have the test contact. So both of these are the same thing. You can check either one you want. Same thing. All right, so that's like 90% of any test you will probably end up writing will end up being something like this. You guys have any questions real quick? Boring you all to tears. I knew it. All right, well, so one more. Let's see, how are we doing on time? 2:10. Another thing that you'll end up using in Angular a lot in order to make your apps a little bit easier to work on is services or factories. And that's just basically a way to place a common code that you're going to use across multiple directives or controllers or other things. So I want to add something on here where I click on the age of the name and I want it to turn into a random number. So let's change that up real quick. So say ANG click set random age. There you go. Button default. Okay. I'll come back to them. Yeah. So now we have buttons here for the ages. They don't do anything yet. You can't see them because the fonts are downloaded from Google. To fix that for next time. So let's go back into our contact and we'll say scope.set random age function, and we're going to make a random service here that I'm going to inject. So random. And we'll say scope.contact.age equals random.age. So now we need a random service. So anything that's common for an app, I like putting in the services folder because there's really not any better place to put it. And we'll call it random. App dot factory random. We'll say age function. Turn parse int. So what does this mean? I want to get an age, a random age somewhere between 0 and 100. I did not just make this up off of my head. I Googled it and found it, as any good developer does. All right, so we have that. We have to make sure we add our random service to script source. Services random. Okay, so everything should be wired up. So the fonts come back up. Click on it, and now I got random ages for everybody. Looks good. So how do we test this on the contact side? Because inside here, I can write a test that says, like set random age, and I can say before each, directive scope dot set random age. And I don't know if you just saw that, but set random age. WebStorm is pretty awesome that you get some nice IntelliSense, right, with some JavaScript. I heard some whining over lunch about JavaScript IntelliSense, so I just thought I'd point that out.
Not IntelliSense though, right? Because that's like a Microsoft.
Oh yeah. Whatever. The things show up when you want them. I'll call them. Right. So we want to make sure that the age is set to 1,000 when the random age function is clicked. So we would say equal the directive scope dot contact dot age equals 1,000. So we go look at our tests, and they failed, right? Because it's like 48. Well, okay, so I'll type 48, and I'll save it, and it's like, oh, now it's 96. And it's like, oh my god, this is the worst test ever, right? It's like, how do you, this is the point where you probably quit for the day, go crack open a couple beers and forget about this test, and you're like, oh yeah, did the random thing get finished? And you're like, yeah, it's tested great. Mark the feature complete, because it works great because you wrote the test for it at one point that works. So how do we fix this, right? Well, the fun thing about JavaScript is you can do things like, hey, inject here. So get me the random service. And remember earlier when I was lamenting on how Jasmine is nice versus something else, because it has built-in mocking, so you can replace things. Random age and return 1,000. If you're to use Mocha, you have to use like sign-on or something else to handle this. And then you have to sort of handle like the build-up and tear-down of the sign-on fixtures. And Jasmine does it for you, so I think that's pretty cool. The other thing to note here too is that since services in Angular are singletons, when I poke at one over here and I poke at another injected thing over here, they end up being the same object. So that's how you can get away with this. So we save this, we run our test, and
2 equals still 96.
what's that?
2 equals still 96.
Oh yeah, of course, 1,000. Thank you, sir. Hey, now our tests work, and now we actually have a real test that is checking a service. I have a test that for the random thing that I'm not going to write because that's stupid. Okay, so at this point in the game is sort of like, you kind of, everyone in this room, if you're working on your Angular application, you have pretty much everything you need to go and start adding tests to your own applications. Everything else in Angular sort of works the same paradigm. You inject things, you test things, and you spy on things, and you go on your merry way. I have some more tests that I have like filters and I have all sorts of fun things, but one thing I think is really important is showing protractor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward in time and get to my protractor tests. And we'll come back to that stuff later. So through the magic of television, I added. I have these filters that we can talk about later, how to test these. So I have like an age filter that only shows, like, hey, there's grandma, or, hey, there's the youngsters. We can talk about that later if you guys are interested. But really what I think a lot of value comes in is running end-to-end tests. So let's set that up real quick. The thing that you need to run end-to-end tests is called Protractor. And it's set up just like Jasmine, right? So Protractor used to be called not Test Actor, because that's Karma. I'm blanking. It just used to be called like the Angular E2E runner. And someone at Google was like, well, this thing kind of sucks, so we should start replacing it. And it uses WebDriver and like Selenium style things in order to talk to the browser. Anyways, none of that really matters, because what really matters is how you set it up, right? So we have some Chrome, and we want to run some specs. And looks like I already went one step too far. Let's go back. Go back in time. There we go. Now it's gone. Okay. Try again. Let's do this real quick. Protractor conf. Oops. Exports config. The reason why I'm typing Chrome only true is because all the other browsers you have to have a Selenium server running, but Chrome has fancy hooks already built in because they're Chrome and that's how they like to roll. So we're just going to use that because it's 1,000 times easier for the demo. If you're in a real situation where you actually have to like test against Internet Explorer for some reason and you hate yourself, you can wire this up here. All right, so now we got that running, and now let's make some EDE tests. E2E, because that's what everyone calls it.
End to end?
Yes, you were right, sir. That's so much to type. So bueno. Context. Okay, so you're going to notice these are going to look exactly the same. They did this on purpose. Open main page, right? So we're going to say var index page. Now, I could just start writing in some like Selenium like jibber jabber right here, and it gets really messy. They suggest not doing that. They suggest putting all of your Selenium jibber jabber up higher. So we're going to make something called the index page, and this is going to have some stuff on it. So we're going to say this.navigate browser. The browser is how you interact with the browser that you want to test against. So we're going to say, hey, go to my awesome website. So now we don't care about like what the website is. We have that wrapped. And we're going to say like this.context equals what you need to do in order to find the stuff is you have to tell Protractor, you have to say, hey, go find this certain set of elements on the page. And I don't know, how many of you guys have worked with like Selenium stuff before? You remember you're like, oh, go find like IDs with classes, and like you like try to find the things and it's hard to find them and it's weird.
XPath,
Yeah, exactly. So the testing team at Angular, they were like, hey, we know that you're going to be writing some Angular tests, so let's add some Angular niceties in here in your test so that we can find things better. So I'm going to say, give from the elements, all elements, I'm going to say by repeater. This is an Angular specific one. Repeater says contact in context. This might look familiar. I wrote this earlier when I was in here. Contact in context. So what that means is that inside of your test, you can use Angular bindings in order to go find the elements that you want to test against. So they end up being the same thing. So we're going to say, down here in our test, now that we have some basic stuff wired up, we're going to say new index page. We're going to say index.navigate. Protractor, go to this page. If we were to run this right now, it's actually not going to do anything, so I'll put a blank test in here. So we'll say Protractor, and you'll see the web page starts up, and it's going to be slow, and then nothing happened. Test passed because there's nothing in here. So I'm literally making tests that's going to open up the page, wait for it to load, and then start doing things with it. Just like a real user would. So we're going to say like shows 5 contacts. Because if you remember, there are 5 people I put in my family today. And we're going to say 2 equal index.contacts. And contacts is all my repeater elements. Dot count 2 equal 5. Let's run our test again. The page slowly loads up because the use Wi-Fi sucks, and then hey, we have a test. You know, it's not 15 people. You know, it was 5. And I don't know if you guys caught this or not, but there's a lot of value in writing your end-to-end tests exactly like you write your unit tests. How many? I mean, think about projects you've been on where they had end-to-end tests, where it was like, write your unit tests in like end unit over here, and then write your end-to-end tests in like Ruby stuff over here. You know, something silly like that, where it's like they're very different. So you have like testing engineers who are good at writing tests for end-to-end stuff, and you have like your regular engineers who are just writing your code. There's a lot of value in all the developers being able to write end-to-end tests or regular unit tests. One thing that you might notice that looks weird is you like, why is this a parenthesis? Well, when WebDriver is talking to Chrome, it's very asynchronous. Like everything is promise-based, and so what you could do is you could say like index.contacts.count, and you do like a then, and you pass in a function, and you get to like the value. That gets really verbose pretty fast, right? So what the Angular testing team did is that they patched Jasmine to know how to unwrap promises. So now you got, it's, you know, that's the whole point, is to make your developers as productive as possible, right? So we can keep going along with our stuff. Now, if we wanted to say like, you know, look at the value on here, like find a button, you know, like it says 29 right now, click it and make sure it goes, or click this and make sure it goes up 1. The code for that looks a little different than anything else in the Jasmine I've shown you, so I'm just going to fast forward so I don't have to type it all out and show you real quick. Where is it? 13. Okay. And we'll just go over it so I don't have to type it all. So what I'm going to say is that I'm going to find a contact on the page. I'm going to get the text value of whatever the age is for that contact, and then I'm going to click the picture, and then I'm going to recheck what the text value of that is and make sure that it went up 1. Well, since they're all strings, I have to evaluate them in ints to make sure I can do math instead of like concatenating strings together. So then you end up having to use this then stuff a lot, and to be honest, I've only used Protractor like a little small amount, so maybe there's a better way. Like going through the docs, it showed like you can write a lot of your own selectors and your own like repeaters and finders and things. So I'm not sure if this is the best way, but it looked fairly straightforward. It's just your tests end up getting kind of, they seem verbose. And so I honestly don't know a good answer around all of that. But this is how you find something on the page, and then you can check values against it, which you get value on, instead of like hard coding like, oh, it's 29, and then it goes up to 30 or something. Because then when, you know, that data changes in your phone, you know your test broke. So moral of the story is, testing seems like it takes a lot of time, but it can save you a lot of time too. One thing that I didn't really spend a lot of time about that I'm going to do now is I think most of these tests I wrote suck. I don't think that they provide any value. Like a lot of these times I'll like make sure that, you know, something exists, right? Like, you know, I created an element or I created a controller. I think this is dumb. I would never, anytime I see tests like this, I just take them out because they're not providing any value. Obviously, if the contracts controller wasn't there, then, you know, stuff down here wouldn't work, other tests. So to me personally, I feel like having good like end-to-end tests that hit like a lot of points of your system, and then having like a good set of like unit tests on like either complicated logic that has a lot of different paths, or like edge case things that your end-to-end tests aren't going to hit. They really need to work in conjunction. Otherwise, you're just like wasting a lot of time writing a lot of dumb code that just end up doing the same thing. Like you're duplicating effort a lot. But you know, it's kind of like what makes sense for you and your team. And so that's why I feel like using Protractor with Angular and the unit tests all together is like a big suite instead of having one team doing end-to-end tests and one team doing unit tests, having them be separate doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I feel like they should definitely all be together. So a lot of these tests I think are stupid. I wouldn't write any of them. That's stupid, you know. Like even this one that like loading data, you would never test if data loads. Obviously you know that works because either your app won't work. So it's like, you know, most of this stuff is junk. I would just, my code review would be like, rip it all out, it's garbage. But it helps explain how it works, but in the end, you never write this. It just makes me sad. So the one thing that you have to remember though is when you're writing your end-to-end tests is that they're slow, right? Like you saw it takes like 4 seconds to run one end-to-end test to load up the page and get everything done. It's not linearly scaled. It's like you open the page and you do a bunch of things on it and you move on. Where like the unit tests are running in, you know, that much time. So that's kind of the other place where you have to figure out like, you don't want like so many end-to-end tests that you can't hold your breath and have them all run, or you know, do something silly like, you know, you should like run the tester and then like go out for a 5-mile jog and it's still running, because then you're not getting any value out of it. But it's just kind of a balance you have to find with your teams.
Can you run protractor tests that don't actually spin up a new browser? It does it all, like it builds it without having to open up a web page or whatever?
So that's what protractor's for, is opening up the actual page and making sure that things are working.
Can't you simulate, if you're running it on a server in the command line, you don't want the page to open up, but you want to be able to kind of render it in the engine and check that it's all there, but not
so
see it?
You can use like Phantom to
Right.
kind of do that, but Phantom isn't like a real Chrome browser. It's like an old Safari thing.
Right.
So it's just kind of like, that's why you have like CI environments that know how to open those things up. And you know, when you set up your end-to-end test, you have like, you know, data that you want to set up beforehand. There's a lot more that goes into end-to-end testing. So if you have them set up well, there's a lot of value there. If you can't do that, obviously you need more robust unit testing. And you know, that helps with your devs too, like with refactor situations and that sort of stuff. So I guess my big preach is, you know, be able to run both easily and be able to update both easily. I'm on, like, the project I'm on now, one of the guys tried adding, like, spec flow stuff, and I was like, well, you know, spec flow, like, stuff looks like this, and then our unit tests look another way, and it was just like, I don't want to deal with it. And so no one's dealt with it. It's just sitting there. It doesn't provide any value at all.
So you said that it's relatively slow compared to unit tests, yeah, but compared to Selenium itself, if you're running basic Selenium with not the Angular
Right.
support on the page, it's relatively way faster.
Yeah, for sure. And then what's nice too is that since you're running these end-to-end tests, and it's like an Angular version of, you know, something that it knows about Angular. You can do things like turn off animations. Like if you're using Angular animations, you can turn those off before you run all of your tests. I don't remember what the actual command is, but you know, you can sort of like set up your app to be faster than like, so it's less pretty, and that can add some value too. So, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but you guys, do you want to see any of the other things? Like, so the other example things I have that we can look at are timeout. Like, I can show you how the filters work, or